This is not the story of the moment the asteroid struck Earth. It is the story of the last survivors, the ones who lived long enough to witness an entire world dying. More than 70,000 years after the Chicxulub apocalypse, in a cold forest blanketed in ash, a small shadow weaves through layers of decaying leaves. It is the final representative of a lineage that had ruled Earth for tens of millions of years. No one knows it is the last. No one knows that after it, the age of dinosaurs will end forever. To understand why it became so utterly alone, we must return to the fateful moment when the sky exploded, the ground convulsed, and life began its countdown. As the Chicxulub asteroid tore through the atmosphere, the sky of the late Cretaceous seemed ripped apart by a blazing white fire. That 10-kilometer wide rock was traveling at more than 20 kilometers per second, a speed that modern simulations confirm could release energy equal to billions of nuclear bombs. And then, the instant it struck the Yucatan Peninsula, every familiar rule of Earth collapsed. The ground beneath the impact point vaporized instantly. Rock, minerals, and the shallow waters of the Caribbean all turned to vapor within a fraction of a second. A crater nearly 180 kilometers wide opened like a gaping wound in the planet, exposing layers of ancient rock long hidden beneath the surface. The entire region vanished from the map almost instantly. A colossal fireball erupted, brighter than any light Earth had seen in hundreds of millions of years. Temperatures at the impact site may have exceeded several thousand degrees Celsius, a figure based on thermal models used by scientists, not dramatic exaggeration. Any creature within hundreds of kilometers was incinerated before it could even comprehend what was happening. As the shock wave expanded, the air compressed and then blasted outward, generating winds that may have reached thousands of kilometers per hour. In once lush forests, ancient trees snapped in an instant, ripped from the ground like straw. Dirt and stone were hurled high into the atmosphere, then rained back down upon Earth as flaming projectiles. Modern research suggests that this planet-wide firestorm ignited countless infernos that spread across continents and oceans alike. Out at sea, water was forced upward by the impact shock, forming mega tsunamis 1 to 1.5 kilometers tall, an estimate based on tsunami deposits discovered today. Those towering walls of water scoured coastlines, erasing entire ecosystems in minutes. Between 10 minutes and 1 hour after the strike, the sky shifted to a murky yellow, then a deep red as dust and sulfur spread through the atmosphere. The air filled with fine ash, making breathing difficult for most large creatures. Animals unable to burrow, dive deep, or flee rapidly from the affected zones were pushed toward extinction within the first hour. By sunset, a second disaster began, one even deadlier than the impact itself. Billions of tons of dust and sulfur dispersed through the stratosphere, blocking almost all sunlight. By the next day, Earth had fallen into a heavy darkness, even though the sun still rose behind the dust clouds. The dim, hazy light was no longer sufficient to sustain photosynthesis. Global temperatures plummeted, shifting from scorching heat to bitter cold in less than a single day. Species dependent on vision, many large birds, pterosaurs, and sight-oriented carnivorous dinosaurs were among the first victims of the darkness. Some died from smoke inhalation, others from the rapid temperature drop, and many simply could not find food in the chaos. By the end of the first night after the impact, Earth no longer resembled the world it had been. The surface still glowed faintly red from ongoing wildfires, while the sky above was black as an abyss. And though this scene was already terrifying, scientists confirmed this was only the beginning. The Cretaceous ecosystem would not collapse in a single day, but through a chain reaction lasting months, then years. A slow yet irreversible process, beginning at this very moment. The first day after the impact ended in ash and darkness, but Earth still had to endure even harsher consequences in the hours that followed. As the sky turned completely pitch black, dense ash continued spreading through the atmosphere, absorbing heat and sunlight. Some climate models show that within 24 to 48 hours, sunlight reaching the ground dropped by more than 90%. This isn't guesswork. It's based on chemical analysis of sulfur-rich and carbon-burned sediment layers formed immediately after the impact. The lack of sunlight pushed all plant life into paralysis. Without photosynthesis, vegetation entered survival mode and gradually dried out. Forests already burning from the previous day were carried further by high winds, expanding into enormous sheets of fire. Ash from these fires mixed with sulfur and ejecta from the impact, forming a global veil across the planet. Some scientists describe this stage as a nuclear night, a condition Earth had never experienced in its nearly 4 billion-year history. Large animals began facing the first harsh reality of the post-impact world: starvation. Herbivorous dinosaurs, entirely dependent on plant life, quickly became the next victims. No more forests, no fresh leaves, no sprawling green plains as before. Even species with the widest roaming ranges and toughest digestive systems could not adapt to the speed at which the ecosystem was collapsing. In more distant regions, where the shock wave had not directly devastated the terrain, the collapse unfolded more slowly, but inevitably. The remaining herds of hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, and ankylosaurs tried to move away from burn zones in search of food, but the distance between surviving patches of vegetation grew wider every day. Some estimates suggest that within 1 to 2 weeks, most herbivorous dinosaurs had already weakened severely from starvation or heat stress, especially in regions where climate shifts were most abrupt. Meanwhile, carnivores, seemingly poised to survive longer thanks to scavenging, faced a different reality. In truth, they only held on for a short time more. T-Rex, Dakota raptor, and other large theropods had extremely high energy demands. They needed vast amounts of food to maintain body temperature and function. As prey numbers collapsed suddenly, they were forced to expand their hunting ranges, burning even more energy. Some individuals may have died within the first week, not from the impact itself, but from starvation and exhaustion in a world steadily going dark. Yet not all creatures shared this catastrophic fate. Small, often overlooked species of the Cretaceous proved to have extraordinary resilience. The small mammals of this era, including early relatives of placental and marsupial mammals, were already accustomed to living in darkness, burrowing, and being active at night. When the outside world descended into chaos, these habits became their greatest advantage. They sheltered in underground burrows where temperatures were more stable and toxic smoke was greatly reduced. Another group that unexpectedly gained the upper hand was freshwater turtles. They could dive deep, tolerate murky and low-light environments, and even survive long periods with very little oxygen. Small crocodilians behaved similarly. They relied on extremely efficient energy conservation, remaining motionless for days without needing to hunt. The primitive birds that survived were mostly the small, ground-foraging or generalist feeders, especially seed-eaters. Seeds can lie dormant in soil for months or even years while retaining nutrients. This made them a precious, energy reserve at a time when nearly all vegetation was collapsing. Still, no creature, no matter how small, was completely spared from Earth's transformation. By the second week, global temperatures began to fall sharply. The atmosphere cooled, and light nearly vanished. This reduced insect activity, a critical food source for many of the surviving small animals. The food chain fractured yet another layer. 2 weeks after the impact, Earth had shifted from a thriving planet to a dark, freezing, unnervingly silent world. Large animals had nearly vanished from many regions, leaving only small creatures, once considered insignificant, now holding the keys to planetary survival. And although darkness continued, this was only the opening phase of a slow extinction that would unfold for years to come. 1 month after the impact, Earth had entered what many scientists call a long winter. The sky was still covered by a massive cloud of dust composed of sulfur, wildfire ash, carbon, and silicate particles hurled into the atmosphere during the impact. Sunlight, the primary driver of life, now reached the ground only as a faint, broken beam of dull yellow-gray light, hardly usable for photosynthesis. By this time, much of Earth's plant life had died or was in terminal decline. Forests, once lush and green, had burned away, leaving behind only blackened trunks standing starkly on the cold ground. Even drought-tolerant or long-dormant plant species could not survive the drastic cooling and near-complete loss of light. Fossil pollen studies show a severe drop in plant diversity during this period, clear evidence of the total collapse of photosynthesis, a scenario reproduced with high accuracy in many modern climate models. Terrestrial food webs entered their fastest stage of collapse. Herbivorous dinosaurs had nearly vanished within weeks, but by the first month, the last surviving large predators were also on the brink of extinction. Without prey, they simply could not survive. Scattered skeletons found in geological layers show that many theropods died in a state of prolonged starvation, ribs protruding, bodies emaciated, a sign perfectly consistent with an ecosystem collapsing too quickly to sustain them. Meanwhile, the oceans began undergoing a separate but equally catastrophic mass extinction. The loss of light caused phytoplankton, the foundation of the marine food chain, to nearly disappear. This conclusion is supported by deep-sea sediment samples worldwide. Fossilized microalgae are virtually absent in the boundary layer between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. When phytoplankton could no longer photosynthesize, the entire oceanic ecosystem collapsed in a domino effect. Zooplankton died next, followed by fish, mollusks, and finally the large marine reptiles such as mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. Some scientific hypotheses suggest that the oceans experienced a period of severe oxygen depletion, making survival even more difficult, though the exact magnitude of this phenomenon is still under study. On land, a few small groups of organisms continued to endure. Small mammals, often weighing only a few hundred grams, survived thanks to extraordinarily flexible survival strategies. They dug deep into the ground and ate anything they could find, remaining roots, seeds, insects, and even the carcasses of other creatures. Some species could lower their metabolic rate to conserve energy, entering a state similar to hibernation. This allowed them to outlast a period that most large animals could not endure. Turtles and small crocodilians also continued to survive thanks to their slow lifestyles, low energy needs, and ability to persist in dirty, low-light aquatic environments. They are the clearest examples of how life sometimes triumphs through frugality rather than strength. However, not all birds survived. Many primitive bird species, especially those dependent on forests or open environments, gradually died off due to food shortages and insufficient energy to migrate. The surviving groups were mainly small, burrowing, seed-eating or omnivorous species with lightweight skeletons and flexible metabolisms. Based on biological remains, many scientists believe that the earliest modern birds survived this period because they could exploit a wider variety of food sources than their ancestors. By the time 6 months to 1 year had passed after the impact, Earth had changed completely. Global temperatures had dropped by 5 to 15 degrees Celsius, depending on the region, bringing frost to places that had never seen snow. Winds carrying fine dust blew for months, coating the ground in a gray layer of ash that made the environment even harsher. Species unable to adapt to darkness and freezing cold vanished from history. This was the stage when the mass extinction reached its most severe point. It is estimated that up to 75% of all species on Earth disappeared in less than a year, a figure confirmed by fossil data worldwide. Yet even in this darkest period, the foundations of a new world were gradually forming. Small, unremarkable species endured the ordeal and prepared to enter the most explosive evolutionary era in their history. 1 year after the impact, Earth had become a cold, gray, eerily silent world. The sky had still not fully cleared. Sulfur particles and fine ash suspended in the stratosphere continued to reflect sunlight back into space. Although the coverage had decreased compared to the first weeks, sunlight was still weak and scattered. Global temperatures remained far below those of the Cretaceous, creating an environment in which very few large species could survive. By this time, most creatures that once dominated the Cretaceous had vanished. The giant dinosaurs, from seasonally migrating hadrosaur herds to the iconic horned ceratopsians, no longer appeared in any region reconstructed from geological layers. Their disappearance was not instantaneous, but a prolonged collapse over many months, accelerated by food shortages, freezing conditions, and the complete breakdown of ecosystems. However, in regions far from the equator, especially the far northern areas of North America, ecosystems collapsed more slowly. These were places where smaller dinosaur populations, including certain polar hadrosaur groups, may have survived longer than most of their relatives. Although this remains speculative based on fragmentary fossils and stratigraphic evidence, many paleontologists believe some isolated populations may have survived for several additional generations before finally going extinct. Even so, there is no evidence that they survived beyond several thousand years after the impact. As Earth entered the second, third, and then fifth year, the sky gradually became clearer. Dust settled bit by bit, leaving behind a cold planet that nonetheless began to show faint signs of recovery. From cracks in rocks and along stream banks, mosses and ferns, the plant groups most tolerant of darkness began to appear. There were no forests, no complex vegetation, but the return of moss marked the very first sign of ecosystem rebuilding. And at this moment, the creatures that had survived the darkest phase began entering a new era of growth. Small mammals, once just humble silhouettes in the world of dinosaurs, began expanding their ranges. With no giant herbivores or carnivores left to compete with, they exploited every opportunity they could, occupying abandoned burrows, searching for remaining insects, and feeding on carcasses left behind after the long winter. Fossil samples show their diversity increased rapidly within a few thousand years after the impact. matching predictions that the removal of previously dominant species was the most important evolutionary driver of this period. Meanwhile, early modern birds, the only surviving winged dinosaurs, slowly adapted to the new conditions. Small seed-eating species had the greatest advantage, as seeds could endure long periods of low light. Many species began abandoning the forest canopy, which no longer existed, and lived in more open environments such as riverbanks, valleys, and cold plains. They flew low, searching for food among patches of regenerating vegetation. In contrast, the pterosaurs, their ancient relatives, could not adapt. Modern studies show that pterosaurs relied heavily on vision and needed ecosystems rich in small animals, fish, or insects. The harsh post-impact environment caused their entire food web to collapse. Some hypotheses propose that smaller Ashdarkid pterosaurs may have survived longer than the large ones due to lower energy requirements. But no fossil evidence confirms their survival beyond a few thousand years after the extinction event. If any did persist until this point, this would likely have been the final stage of their 150 million year lineage. By the time Earth approached the 10,000-year mark after the impact, it had taken on an entirely new appearance. The sky brightened again, though the climate remained colder than before. Mosses and ferns blanketed the lowlands, paving the way for the appearance of the first flowering plants of the recovery period. Small mammals grew more diverse. Early modern birds claimed the skies, and the primitive ecosystems of the Paleogene gradually took shape. This was the point at which every last remnant of the Cretaceous, if any had survived, was gone. No more non-avian dinosaurs, no more pterosaurs, no more giants that had ruled Earth for tens of millions of years. The post-Chicxulub world had officially been handed over to smaller, tougher, more adaptable species. Creatures that would write Earth's next chapters for tens of millions of years to come. 10,000 years after the Chicxulub impact, Earth had emerged from global darkness but had not yet returned to stability. The atmosphere grew clearer, light returned, and new vegetation, mainly mosses, ferns, and primitive shrubs, spread across the land. Ecosystems were still simple, but sufficient to support small mammals, early modern birds, and slow-living reptiles like turtles and crocodiles. By this time, most species of the Cretaceous had already been extinct for a very long period. Even so, some small, isolated groups, especially small dinosaurs and pterosaurs, may have survived longer than popular accounts usually describe. Paleontologists have found certain sediment samples in North America and Central Asia, suggesting that a few small herbivorous dinosaurs may have persisted for a short time after the KPG boundary. However, this evidence remains controversial and is not considered definitive. Still, if these late surviving groups truly existed, then the period from 10,000 to 20,000 years after the impact was likely the final moment when the footsteps of non-avian dinosaurs echoed on Earth. With no forests, no grasslands, and no abundant food sources, these last populations gradually weakened. Temperatures remained far colder than in the Cretaceous, and the erratic climate, shifting between wet and dry, made stable plant growth nearly impossible. Herbivores dependent on fresh vegetation and soft fruits could not survive such conditions. They died off due to starvation, disease, and the loss of habitable environments. A few individuals may have endured for several more seasons, but eventually all vanished. In the skies, the final remnants of the pterosaurs also faced extinction. Large pterosaurs had died out almost immediately after the impact. but smaller Ajdarchids, lightweight and requiring less energy, may have survived longer. This inference is supported by several researchers based on their body size and energy demands. However, no fossil evidence proves that they lived tens of thousands of years after the event. If they did survive, this period would have been the very end for them. By then, the food web had changed completely. Insects appeared only seasonally, and small fish and amphibians lived sparsely in newly formed wetlands. None of these resources were sufficient to sustain a pterosaur population in the long term. The last individuals, perhaps only a few scattered in warm equatorial regions, would have had to fly farther and farther to find prey, while their wing strength and energy reserves steadily dwindled. Some ecological simulations suggest that they may have died from exhaustion more often than from starvation. The remaining primitive bird groups had also dwindled to just a few small species. Many species with ancient skull and skeletal features, direct descendants of Cretaceous bird lineages, could not adapt to the unstable climate or the competition from lighter, more flexible modern birds. This was the period in which the last archaic birds were completely replaced. Numerous fossil studies indicate that most of them disappeared before the 50,000-year mark after the impact. The earliest modern birds, capable of exploiting seeds, insects, and in some cases even small prey, gradually expanded their ranges and filled the remaining ecological gaps. By roughly 50,000 to 70,000 years after the impact, Earth glowed a pale yellow under the faint sunlight of a slowly recovering sun. Newly formed wetlands, shrublands, and low-lying vegetation began to spread. But in some regions, particularly near the equator, the environment remained harsh, alternating between long droughts and sudden heavy rains. And in these conditions, the last survivors of the Cretaceous, whether archaic birds or pterosaurs, may have lived their final days. Imagine a small pterosaur, a slender-bodied creature with wings pressed against the damp wind. It glides across a sky reopening after thousands of years of darkness, searching for a flicker of movement among scattered shrubs. No companions remain, no familiar calls echo back. If it collapses onto the ground in exhaustion during its final flight, then in that moment, a 150-million-year lineage ends with it. This is not a scene confirmed by fossils. Science cannot preserve the final moment of a species. But it is a scenario built from ecological models and the environmental conditions of the post-impact world. It is the closest image we can form of the true ending of the Cretaceous. By around 100,000 years after the Chicxulub event, every last trace of the Mesozoic biosphere had vanished from Earth. Non-avian dinosaurs, pterosaurs, archaic birds, all had left history. In their place rose a planet ruled by modern birds, placental mammals, marsupials, and resilient reptiles. Earth had fully entered a new chapter of the Paleogene, where small, flexible, resource-efficient organisms became the heirs of an entire world. More than 100,000 years after the asteroid fell, Earth had completely changed hands. The giant figures that once dominated the planet remained only in sedimentary rock layers, while the New World belonged to the small creatures that endured the darkest era. Life did not disappear. It regenerated in ways no one could have predicted. And from the ashes of the Cretaceous, Earth's new chapter began. Quiet, but more resilient than ever.